History remembers the names it is comfortable with. It forgets the ones that disrupt its order. In 1919, a black boy solved a problem scholars said could not be solved, not because it was impossible, but because no one expected him to be the one who solved it. This is not a story about numbers. It is a story about permission and what happens when brilliance appears, where it was never meant to exist. Before we get started, tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is for you. And don't forget to subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss a chilling story. Stay with us until the end. And when this story concludes, leave a comment telling us how powerful this story felt, because what you're about to hear is not just forgotten history. It is history that was quietly pushed aside, softened by time, and buried beneath the language of progress. In 1901, the world believed it was entering an age ruled by precision. Empires measured their strength in steel and tonnage. Cities grew according to blueprints traced by engineers, and governments trusted calculations to make sense of chaos left behind by war. Mathematics was not merely a subject taught in classrooms, it was the spine of modern life. Bridges stood because numbers held them. Economies expanded because equations predicted growth. Artillery was aimed by trigonometry, and factories ran by ratios and efficiency curves. Numbers were treated as impartial, incorruptible, above the flaws of human judgment. But while mathematics itself was presented as pure, access to it was anything but. Who was allowed to learn deeply, who was permitted to question, and who could be recognized as brilliant was decided long before any equation was solved. Genius in that era did not simply appear. It was granted permission to exist. The boy was born into this contradiction. A black child in a society that spoke of progress while fiercely protecting its hierarchies. From the moment he could observe the world around him, he learned that rules were not evenly applied. He noticed how time moved differently depending on who controlled it, how labor was measured with ruthless accuracy while dignity was never counted at all. He watched adults calculate costs and profits with ease while dismissing the human lives that made those calculations possible. Numbers were everywhere, shaping decisions large and small, and yet the people most affected by those numbers were rarely taught how they worked. For him, this imbalance planted a quiet curiosity. Not the loud curiosity that demands answers immediately, but the patient kind that watches, waits, and stores information. When he first encountered arithmetic, it did not feel foreign. Counting, adding, dividing, these were extensions of patterns he had already learned by watching the world. He understood balance before he knew the word for it. He understood proportion by observing scarcity and excess. When teachers introduced numbers on a chalkboard, he did not see symbols to be memorized. He saw relationships he already recognized. This made his learning appear effortless, which unsettled those responsible for guiding him. Effortless understanding challenges authority because it suggests knowledge can exist without instruction. And knowledge without instruction is difficult to control. At first, his teachers treated his ability as a novelty. He was praised cautiously, the way one might praise a coincidence without believing it will repeat. When he answered questions quickly, they suspected guessing. When he solved problems meant for older students, they assumed luck. Each correct answer forced them to confront an uncomfortable possibility, and rather than accept it, they recalibrated their expectations downward. He was encouraged to slow down, to follow steps more visibly, to avoid jumping ahead. These instructions were framed as guidance, but they carried an unspoken message: do not exceed what is expected of you. As he grew older, that gap between expectation and reality widened. Algebra, when introduced, did not intimidate him. Variables felt natural, symbols standing in for unknowns the same way people stood in for roles in society. Geometry appealed to him in a different way. Shapes, angles, and proofs mirrored the spatial awareness he had developed navigating spaces where he was often unwelcome. Where other students memorized theorems, he visualized them. Where others relied on repetition, he relied on comprehension. His work was not just correct, it was efficient, elegant in ways that suggested an internal logic rather than rote learning. This elegance made those around him uneasy. Excellence that follows the curriculum can be managed. Excellence that moves beyond it raises questions no institution wants to answer. His notebooks began to reflect this divergence. They were not filled with copied problems and solutions, but with explorations, questions branching into other questions, diagrams annotated with observations rather than instructions, margins crowded with alternative approaches. He was not content to know that something worked. He needed to understand why it worked, and whether it could work differently. Access to knowledge became increasingly inconsistent. Some books appeared briefly, passed along or left unattended, and disappeared just as quickly. Others were conspicuously absent, kept out of reach by policies no one explained openly. He learned to work with fragments. A definition here, a theorem there, a partial explanation that required reconstruction. This method of learning sharpened his intuition but distanced him from the formal language of academia. He was teaching himself how to think, not how to present his thinking in a way institutions preferred. By the time he reached adolescence, his curiosity had narrowed onto a particular problem that resisted easy classification. It appeared in discussions among scholars as an example of limitation, a demonstration of where existing methods reached their boundary. It was not framed as unsolvable in a dramatic sense, but as unresolved, inconvenient, something to be set aside rather than pursued. To him, it felt incomplete. He did not know its reputation, and that ignorance was an advantage. Reputation can paralyze inquiry. He approached the problem without reverence, seeing only a structure that did not yet fit together. His process was slow and deliberate. He tested assumptions that others accepted without question. He dismantled familiar methods when they failed him, even when those methods were widely respected. This willingness to abandon authority in favor of understanding was not rebellious in intent, it was practical. He cared less about tradition than about coherence. When the solution began to take shape, it did not arrive as a sudden revelation but as a gradual alignment, pieces settling into place through persistence rather than inspiration. He checked his work repeatedly, aware that correctness alone would not be enough to secure acceptance. When the moment came for his solution to be reviewed, the atmosphere was not celebratory. The mathematics held. That was clear. What was unclear and deeply unsettling was how it had come from him. The silence that followed his presentation was not admiration. It was calculation. Authority does not fear error as much as it fears displacement. His solution implied that knowledge could emerge outside approved channels, that brilliance could surface without permission. That implication threatened more than any incorrect answer ever could. The response unfolded cautiously. His work was described as interesting, a word that allows engagement without commitment. Further review was requested. Questions were raised, not about the solution of validity, but about its origin. How had he learned what he knew? Who had guided him? These questions were not neutral. They were attempts to trace authority backward, to locate an acceptable source. When no such source could be identified, discomfort grew. Time passed. Decisions were delayed. Invitations failed to materialize. And then, something subtle happened. The problem he had solved began to appear elsewhere, discussed as newly resolved, framed within more conventional language, detached from the context of his contribution. The solution circulated without him. The system absorbed the knowledge while quietly discarding the knower. For the boy, this process was confusing at first. He believed still that clarity would eventually assert itself. Mathematics, after all, rewarded consistency. Truth revealed itself through repetition and verification. But as weeks turned into months, the pattern became undeniable. Recognition was not following achievement. It was following alignment with existing structures. His work was valuable. His authorship was not. This realization marked a turning point. It did not extinguish his curiosity, but it altered his relationship with the world around him. He began to see that progress was not a simple accumulation of ideas, but a selective process shaped by power. Mathematics advanced, but the narrative of who advanced it was carefully curated. His exclusion was not an accident. It was a consequence of systems designed to maintain comfort rather than truth. He continued to work, but increasingly in isolation. Access to advanced material became unpredictable. Support dwindled. Curiosity, once tolerated, now drew quiet caution. He learned that brilliance could become a liability when it disrupted hierarchy. No one needed to tell him to stop. The environment itself communicated the limits of what was acceptable. And yet, he did not abandon mathematics. To do so would have meant surrendering the one space where the world still made sense to him. Instead, he retreated inward, returning to numbers not as a path to recognition, but as a private refuge. He solved problems because they demanded solving, not because they promised reward. Understanding became its own justification. This period of inward focus sharpened his thinking in unexpected ways. Freed from the need to conform to institutional expectations, He explored ideas that lay beyond immediate application. He ventured into abstractions that would not gain prominence until years later. His notebooks from this time, had they been preserved and studied carefully, would reveal insights that anticipated future developments. But without an audience, these ideas remained dormant, seeds scattered without soil. What makes this story difficult is not the absence of drama, but the presence of quiet efficiency. There was no public rejection, no explicit denial of his talent. There was simply a steady narrowing of possibility, a gradual redirection of his contributions away from visibility. This is how erasure often works. Not through confrontation, but through omission. Not by denying ability, but by denying ownership. The world moved on, buoyed by mathematics that increasingly resembled the ideas he had explored in solitude. Others received credit, others built careers. His work existed in margins and footnotes, if it existed at all. History recorded results, not the conditions under which they were achieved. By the time his ideas were fully integrated into the discipline, his name no longer mattered. Progress had been preserved. Discomfort had been removed. This opening chapter of his story does not end with failure. It ends with clarity. The clarity that brilliance alone is never enough. That access, permission, and recognition are controlled as tightly as any resource. And that progress, for all its claims of neutrality, often advances by quietly deciding who will be remembered and who will not. The clarity he reached did not bring relief. It brought awareness, and awareness carried its own weight. Once he understood that recognition was governed by forces beyond correctness, he began to notice how those forces operated everywhere, not just in mathematics. The same invisible rules that shaped his academic life shaped conversations, opportunities, and even silence. He saw how praise was distributed cautiously, how certain mistakes were forgiven while others were remembered, how potential was celebrated only when it appeared in familiar forms. This realization did not embitter him immediately. Instead, it sharpened his attention. He began to watch the system the way he watched numbers, looking for patterns, testing assumptions, tracing outcomes back to their origins. In the months that followed, he made deliberate choices about how to continue. He could attempt to push harder against the boundaries, to force acknowledgement through persistence and volume, or he could adapt, conserving his energy and redirecting his efforts inward. The first option promised conflict with little chance of success. The second promised solitude, but also autonomy. He chose autonomy. This choice was not resignation, it was strategic withdrawal from a battlefield rigged against him. He did not stop learning. He changed the terms under which learning mattered. Without consistent access to formal resources, he relied increasingly on reconstruction. He took problems he remembered only partially and rebuilt them from first principles. He derived results independently, not because he wanted originality for its own sake, but because he had no alternative. This process deepened his understanding in ways structured education rarely allows. He learned not just what worked, but why it worked and under what conditions it failed. Failure became instructive rather than discouraging. Each dead end clarified the landscape, narrowing the space until a viable path emerged. His notebooks from this period grew denser and more idiosyncratic. They were less concerned with presentation and more with exploration. He developed his own notation where existing symbols felt insufficient. He annotated proofs with questions rather than conclusions, leaving room for revision. To an outsider, the pages might have looked chaotic. To him, they represented a living conversation with ideas, one that did not require validation to continue. Mathematics, stripped of institutional oversight, became a dialogue rather than a performance. Occasionally, he attempted to re-engage with formal channels, submitting work, or sharing insights in settings that promised feedback. Each attempt reinforced the same lesson. Responses focused on form rather than substance. Suggestions emphasized conformity over insight. He was encouraged to align his thinking with established frameworks, to smooth out the very divergences that made his work distinctive. These interactions were framed as mentorship, but they carried an implicit demand: adapt or remain peripheral. He listened carefully, not to comply, but to understand the expectations he was refusing. The broader academic environment of the time provided context for this refusal. Institutions were consolidating authority, defining disciplines more rigidly, establishing criteria for legitimacy that favored lineage and affiliation. This process stabilized knowledge production, but also narrowed its gate. Innovation was welcomed only when it could be traced through acceptable channels. Ideas that emerged outside those channels were treated with suspicion, regardless of merit. The boy's experience was not an aberration within the system. It was a predictable outcome. As he matured, the gap between his internal world and external recognition widened. He continued to think deeply, often venturing into abstractions that would not become mainstream for years. Concepts related to structure, symmetry, and transformation occupied his attention. He explored relationships that transcended specific problems, searching for unifying principles that could explain why certain methods succeeded across contexts. These explorations lacked immediate application, but they satisfied a deeper intellectual need. They allowed him to build a coherent worldview grounded in logic rather than approval. This inward turn did not isolate him completely. He found ways to share his thinking informally in conversations with those willing to listen without judgment. These exchanges were rare but meaningful. They affirmed that understanding could exist outside official recognition, that ideas could resonate even without institutional backing. Still, such moments were fleeting. They did not translate into sustained opportunity. The system as structure remained unchanged. The emotional landscape of this period was complex. Frustrations surfaced intermittently, often triggered by encounters with work that mirrored his own without acknowledging its origins. Reading such papers produced a strange dual sensation, confirmation that his thinking was sound, coupled with the knowledge that this confirmation would never be publicly attributed to him. He learned to sit with this contradiction, neither denying it nor allowing it to consume him. Detachment became a form of self-preservation. He also became acutely aware of time. Youth, which had once shielded him from scrutiny, now worked against him. As he aged, expectations shifted. Prodigy narratives lose their appeal when prodigies grow older without corresponding recognition. Potential unfulfilled becomes suspicion. He sensed this shift and adjusted again, lowering the visibility of his ambitions while maintaining their depth. He understood that the system preferred stories with clear arcs and endings. His story, by contrast, resisted closure. Outside mathematics, the world continued to change rapidly. New technologies emerged. Industries expanded. The demand for quantitative reasoning increased. Mathematics gained cultural prestige, even as access to its higher echelons remained restricted. This contradiction mirrored his own experience on a larger scale. Society celebrated numbers while controlling who could wield them. His invisibility within this landscape was not merely personal. It was symptomatic. He began to reflect more consciously on the relationship between knowledge and power. Mathematics had taught him that systems behave predictably under certain constraints. Social systems, he realized, were no different. They optimized for stability, not fairness. They rewarded compliance, not insight. Once he framed his experience in these terms, it became easier to understand without internalizing blame. The system was functioning as designed. His exclusion was not a malfunction. It was an outcome. This reframing did not absolve the system, but it freed him from the illusion that individual effort alone could overcome structural barriers. It allowed him to redirect his sense of responsibility. Rather than measuring his worth by external markers, he measured it by coherence and integrity of thought. He held himself accountable to understanding, not acclaim. This internal standard sustained him through periods of doubt. There were moments when he considered abandoning mathematics altogether, redirecting his talents to fields where recognition might be more accessible. Each time, he returned to the same conclusion. Mathematics was not simply a skill he possessed. It was a language through which he understood the world. To abandon it would be to silence a fundamental part of himself. He chose instead to maintain his engagement on his own terms, even if those terms consigned him to obscurity. As years accumulated, his perspective broadened. He began to see his experience as part of a larger pattern, one that extended beyond race or era. Throughout history, knowledge had often been extracted from marginalized sources and rebranded under dominant names. The mechanisms varied, but the effect was consistent. Contributions were absorbed, contributors erased. Understanding this pattern did not lessen the injustice, but it contextualized it. His story was not isolated. It was one thread in a much larger tapestry of selective memory. This awareness informed how he interacted with others, particularly younger thinkers navigating similar constraints. He offered guidance without false promises, emphasizing resilience of mind over validation of status. He encouraged curiosity while cautioning against equating brilliance with reward. These conversations, though limited in reach, carried a quiet significance. They represented continuity, the passing of insight that institutions had failed to acknowledge. The longer he lived with this dual reality, internal clarity and external invisibility, the more he recognized the subtle ways it shaped his identity. He learned to inhabit ambiguity without seeking resolution. He accepted that his contributions might never be named, but that they could still matter in ways he would never see. This acceptance was not defeat. It was a recalibration of expectation grounded in realism rather than hope alone. Meanwhile, the mathematical community continued to evolve, revisiting old problems with new tools and perspectives. Solutions emerged that bore striking resemblance to his early work, refined and formalized through collaboration and institutional support. Observing these developments, he felt neither vindicated nor bitter. He felt a quiet confirmation that ideas have their own trajectories independent of those who originate them. This perspective allowed him to appreciate progress without erasing his own experience. The paradox of his life became increasingly clear. He had contributed to a field that prized universality while being excluded by particularity. His thinking aligned with the deepest ideals of mathematics: truth, consistency, elegance, while his social reality contradicted those ideals at every turn. Holding these contradictions simultaneously required a form of intellectual and emotional discipline that few recognized but many benefited from indirectly. By the end of this period, his relationship with mathematics had settled into a steady rhythm. He worked not for recognition, but for understanding. He wrote not to publish, but to clarify. He solved not to impress, but because problems demanded resolution. This rhythm sustained him through the absence of external reward. It allowed him to continue contributing, albeit invisibly, to a body of knowledge that would outlive him. What emerges from this chapter of his story is not a portrait of wasted talent, but of constrained brilliance navigating an environment that could not accommodate it openly. His experience reveals how systems can harness innovation while suppressing its source, how progress can coexist with injustice without resolving it. It sets the stage for a deeper examination of what his erasure meant not just for him, but for the narratives of progress that continue to shape our understanding of history. Because once we recognize how quietly such erasures occur, we are forced to confront a more unsettling question: how much of what we celebrate today rests on foundations we have chosen not to see. As his understanding of the system deepened, something subtle but irreversible shifted in the way he perceived time. Earlier, time had felt like a ladder, each year another rung, each achievement a step upward toward recognition. Now it felt more like a current, moving regardless of his position within it. The world advanced, theories accumulated, institutions expanded, and yet his place remained fixed at the margins. This realization did not halt his thinking, it changed its direction. Instead of measuring progress by milestones others recognized, he began measuring it by depth, coherence, and internal consistency. Time, for him, became less about arrival and more about refinement. He returned to earlier work with a more critical eye, revisiting solutions he had once considered complete. Without the pressure to present or defend them publicly, he felt free to question his own conclusions. He searched for hidden assumptions, alternative formulations, deeper symmetries. This process revealed layers he had not noticed before. Problems he thought he had solved opened into families of related questions. Solutions became starting points rather than endpoints. In this way, isolation paradoxically expanded his intellectual horizon. Deprived of formal collaboration, he developed an unusually intimate relationship with his own thinking. The absence of external validation also changed how he dealt with uncertainty. In institutional settings, uncertainty is often treated as a weakness to be concealed or resolved quickly. Alone, he could afford to dwell in it. He allowed questions to remain open for long periods, trusting that clarity would emerge through sustained attention. This patience, cultivated through necessity, became one of his greatest strengths. He learned to sit with ambiguity without anxiety, to let ideas mature at their own pace. His work increasingly gravitated toward abstraction. Rather than focusing solely on specific problems, he explored underlying structures that connected disparate areas of mathematics. He was drawn to patterns that transcended context, relationships that held regardless of scale or application. These explorations lacked immediate utility, which made them unattractive to institutions focused on measurable outcomes. For him, however, they offered a sense of unity that countered the fragmentation he experienced socially. In abstraction, he found coherence where the world offered division. This turn toward abstraction did not mean detachment from reality. On the contrary, it sharpened his perception of how mathematical structures mirrored social ones. He noticed parallels between hierarchies in algebraic systems and hierarchies in institutions, between constraints in equations and constraints imposed by policy and tradition. These parallels were not perfect, but they were instructive. They reinforced his understanding that systems, whether mathematical or social, operate according to rules that can be studied, predicted, and sometimes exploited. He became particularly interested in the concept of invariance, properties that remain unchanged under transformation. In mathematics, invariance offers stability amid change, a way of identifying what truly matters when everything else shifts. In his own life, invariance took a different form. Despite changes in circumstance, access, and recognition, his commitment to understanding remained constant. This commitment became his anchor, the invariant that defined his identity when external markers failed. As he delved deeper into these ideas, his notation grew increasingly personal. He adapted symbols to reflect relationships he found significant, sometimes inventing shorthand to capture recurring patterns. This idiosyncratic language made his notebooks difficult for others to decipher, but it allowed him to think with precision and speed. Writing became an extension of thought rather than a record of it. Each page bore traces of revision, erasure, and reconfiguration, evidence of a mind in continuous motion. Occasionally, he attempted to translate this private language into more conventional terms, imagining how his ideas might be received if circumstances were different. These exercises were speculative rather than practical. He no longer expected publication, but he remained curious about how his thinking intersected with broader discourse. This curiosity kept him engaged with developments in the field, even as he remained excluded from its formal channels. Reading contemporary work produced mixed emotions. He admired the ingenuity of new approaches, while recognizing familiar threads woven through them. Some papers echoed his own explorations so closely that he could anticipate their conclusions before reaching the final page. This recognition did not provoke anger so much as a quiet acknowledgement of convergence. Ideas, he understood, do not belong exclusively to individuals. They arise when conditions are ripe. His isolation had not prevented others from reaching similar insights. It had only prevented him from being recognized as one of their originators. This perspective allowed him to avoid the bitterness that might otherwise have consumed him. He distinguished between the ideas themselves and the structures that mediated their circulation. The former remained a source of joy and fascination. The latter he regarded with measured skepticism. This distinction preserved his engagement with mathematics while insulating him from the disappointment of unmet expectations. Beyond mathematics, his understanding of the world grew more nuanced. He observed how narratives were constructed, how success stories were curated to reinforce existing beliefs. He saw how history favored continuity over disruption, how anomalies were smoothed out or excised. These observations informed his view of his own erasure. It was not personal animosity that had sidelined him, but narrative convenience. His story complicated the story institutions wanted to tell about themselves. This realization reframed his sense of loss. What had been taken from him was not merely opportunity, but narrative presence. He existed outside the stories that defined progress, even as his work contributed to it. This absence was harder to articulate than overt discrimination, but no less real. It manifested as a gap between contribution and acknowledgement, between impact and memory. He began to think more consciously about memory, how it is preserved, transmitted, and altered. In mathematics, memory takes the form of citation, of named theorems and recognized lineages. Outside that framework, ideas persist only if someone carries them forward. His work, lacking formal attribution, relied on this latter form of persistence. It survived through influence rather than acknowledgement, through resonance rather than record. This reliance on informal transmission troubled him, not because it diminished his pride, but because it obscured responsibility. When ideas circulate anonymously, accountability becomes diffuse, errors are harder to trace, context is lost, understanding becomes detached from origin. He recognized that his erasure did not merely affect him, it affected the integrity of the discipline itself. Mathematics prides itself on rigor and transparency. Selective memory undermines both. Despite this, he did not attempt to reclaim his narrative aggressively. The avenues for doing so remained inaccessible, and the cost of public challenge seemed disproportionate. Instead, he focused on cultivating clarity within his own work, trusting that integrity had value even when unseen. This trust was not naive. It was a deliberate stance against a system that equated worth with visibility. His life during this period settled into a rhythm marked by quiet intensity. Days were structured around thought rather than obligation. He read when material was available, reflected when it was not. He solved problems not because they promised advancement, but because they demanded resolution. This demand came from within, an internal pressure that neither recognition nor neglect could extinguish. Interactions with others were selective. He gravitated toward conversations that prioritized substance over status, curiosity over credential. These interactions, though limited in number, reinforced his sense that understanding could flourish in unexpected places. They reminded him that institutions do not monopolize insight, even if they control its dissemination. As years accumulated, his sense of urgency diminished. Youthful impatience gave way to a steadier confidence in his own trajectory, however unconventional. He accepted that his contributions might never be fully recognized within his lifetime. This acceptance did not diminish their significance. It altered the timeline on which significance was measured. He began to think less about immediate impact and more about continuity, about how ideas might persist beyond him, influencing others in ways he would never witness. This long view brought a measure of peace. It allowed him to situate his experience within a broader historical context, one in which many thinkers had labored in obscurity, their work appreciated only retrospectively, if at all. He did not romanticize this obscurity. He recognized its costs, but he also recognized that value is not always aligned with reward. The paradox of his existence remained unresolved. He lived in a world that benefited from his insights while denying him recognition. He contributed to a discipline that claimed universality while practicing exclusion. Holding this paradox required resilience, not just intellectual but emotional. He cultivated this resilience through discipline of thought, through the quiet satisfaction of understanding, through the refusal to equate invisibility with insignificance. By the end of this phase of his life, he had developed a philosophy that guided his work and sustained his spirit. Knowledge, he believed, was worth pursuing regardless of acknowledgement. Understanding was its own form of freedom. Systems might control recognition, but they could not fully control insight. This belief did not dismantle the structures that had excluded him, but it allowed him to navigate them without surrendering his sense of self. What this chapter reveals is not a retreat from the world, but a reorientation within it. Deprived of conventional pathways, he forged an internal one, marked by depth rather than ascent. His story during this period is not defined by what he lost, but by what he preserved: curiosity, integrity, and a commitment to truth that outlasted the institutions that failed to recognize it. And in preserving these, he laid the groundwork for the final phase of his story, one in which the consequences of erasure extend beyond a single life, shaping how history itself is remembered, questioned, and perhaps slowly corrected. As the years continued to pass, the distance between his internal world and the public narrative of progress became impossible to ignore. What had once felt like a temporary divergence now revealed itself as a permanent condition. The discipline he loved moved forward with increasing confidence, publishing results, naming theories, celebrating figures whose work shaped the century. And woven quietly through that progress were ideas he recognized as familiar, sometimes uncomfortably so. He could trace the lineage of certain concepts back to his own notebooks, to long evenings spent refining arguments that no one had wanted to hear. Yet the names attached to these developments were not his. They belonged to institutions, to individuals whose legitimacy was unquestioned, whose presence fit comfortably within the story mathematics told about itself. This recognition forced him to confront a deeper question than any equation had ever posed. What does it mean to contribute to a world that refuses to acknowledge you? At first, he framed this question intellectually, treating it as another problem to be analyzed. He examined historical precedents, looking for patterns in how knowledge had been transmitted and attributed across time. He found that erasure was not an exception but a recurring feature, particularly when contributions emerged from those excluded from power. The mechanisms varied, sometimes brutal, sometimes polite, but the outcome was consistent. Knowledge advanced, credit consolidated elsewhere. Understanding this pattern did not dull its impact. Instead, it sharpened his sense of responsibility to his own integrity. If recognition could not be trusted as a measure of value, then value had to be defined differently. He began to think of his work less as a bid for acceptance and more as a form of stewardship. Ideas once discovered carried an obligation to be understood deeply, to be handled carefully, to be passed on accurately where possible. This sense of stewardship replaced ambition as his primary motivator. He organized his notebooks more deliberately, not for publication but for clarity. He rewrote sections, refined arguments, and annotated older work with insights gained later. This process was painstaking, but it brought coherence to decades of thought. In doing so, he created a personal archival record of intellectual development that existed independently of institutional validation. Whether anyone else would ever see it remained uncertain. What mattered was that the work itself was preserved with care. At times, he imagined a future reader encountering these notebooks without context. He wondered what such a reader would make of the idiosyncratic notation, the marginal questions, the abrupt shifts in focus. Would they see brilliance or confusion, innovation or eccentricity? These questions lingered unresolved, highlighting the fragility of legacy when detached from recognition. He understood that without institutional framing, interpretation would be unpredictable. This uncertainty did not stop him, but it reminded him how much power lay not in discovery, but in narration. Beyond mathematics, the social world around him reinforced these insights. He watched how achievements were celebrated selectively, how certain stories were amplified while others were quietly sidelined. Progress was presented as linear and inclusive, even as exclusion persisted beneath the surface. This dissonance mirrored his own experience, confirming that his story was not an outlier but a reflection of broader dynamics. Systems prefer narratives that affirm their fairness. Anomalies are inconvenient. He became increasingly attentive to language, how words like merit, objectivity, and excellence were deployed. In theory, these concepts promised neutrality. In practice, they often masked subjective judgments shaped by tradition and bias. He saw how calls for rigor could be used to dismiss unfamiliar approaches, how standards could be enforced unevenly without acknowledgement. This awareness deepened his skepticism toward claims of impartiality, not only in mathematics but in all domains governed by institutional authority. Despite this skepticism, he did not reject institutions wholesale. He recognized their necessity for organizing knowledge, for facilitating collaboration, for preserving continuity. His critique was not of structure itself, but of rigidity of systems that confused their own conventions with universal truth. He believed that mathematics, at its best, thrived on flexibility, on the willingness to question assumptions and explore alternative paths. Institutions, by contrast, often prioritized stability over exploration. This tension lay at the heart of his exclusion. As he reflected on this tension, his thinking expanded beyond individual injustice to collective consequence. What happens, he wondered, when systems consistently marginalize unconventional brilliance? How many ideas are delayed, diluted, or lost entirely because their origin does not align with expectation? These questions troubled him not because they centered on his own experience, but because they implicated the future of knowledge itself. Progress constrained by conformity risks stagnation, even as it appears to advance. He found himself increasingly drawn to teaching, though not in formal settings. Informal conversations, mentorships, and shared problem-solving sessions became outlets for his insights. In these contexts, hierarchy mattered less. Curiosity took precedence over credential. He could engage with others as equals, exchanging ideas without the weight of institutional judgment. These interactions, though limited in scope, affirmed his belief that understanding flourishes most readily where power recedes. In guiding others, he was careful not to replicate the illusions that had once sustained him. He spoke honestly about obstacles, about the difference between talent and opportunity, about the realities of recognition. At the same time, he encouraged intellectual courage, the willingness to pursue questions, regardless of external reward. He framed understanding as an end in itself, a source of resilience in environments that may never fully acknowledge it. This balance between realism and encouragement defined his approach. The passage of time brought new perspectives. Advances in mathematics accelerated, driven by technology and expanding collaboration. Fields emerged that would have been unimaginable when he first began his studies. Some of these fields intersected with ideas he had explored decades earlier, though now expressed through different language and tools. Observing this evolution, he felt a complex mixture of pride and distance. Pride, because the ideas he valued were gaining recognition. Distance, because he remained outside the narrative of their development. He also noticed how history was being written in real time. Textbooks crystallized certain contributions while omitting others. Once canonized, these narratives gained authority, shaping how future generations understood the discipline. He recognized that the longer his absence persisted, the harder it would be to correct. Memory, once fixed, resists revision. This awareness underscored the urgency of preservation, even if acknowledgement remained elusive. At times, he considered actively documenting his story, pairing his mathematical work with an account of the conditions under which it emerged. Such a document could challenge prevailing narratives, offering context where none existed. Yet he hesitated. Without institutional backing, such an account risked dismissal or misinterpretation. It could be reduced to grievance rather than insight, its substance overshadowed by questions of motive. He weighed this risk carefully, ultimately deciding that his energy was better spent refining ideas than defending his past. This decision was not without cost. Silence protected his work from trivialization, but it also allowed erasure to continue unchallenged. He lived with this tension, aware that every choice carried consequences. There was no option that promised justice without sacrifice. In navigating these constraints, he prioritized what he could control: the rigor of his thinking, the clarity of his work, the honesty of his engagement with others. As he aged, physical limitations began to impose their own constraints. Long hours of solitary study became more taxing. He adjusted his routines, focusing on depth rather than breadth, revisiting core questions rather than constantly seeking new ones. This narrowing did not feel like loss. It felt like concentration, a distillation of decades of inquiry into its most essential themes. He returned repeatedly to questions of structure, symmetry, and transformation, finding in them a reflection of his own journey. The idea of transformation, in particular, resonated deeply. In mathematics, transformation reveals invariance properties that persist despite change. In his life, transformation had taken many forms: exclusion, adaptation, withdrawal, and resilience. Through it all, his commitment to understanding had remained invariant. This realization brought a sense of continuity that countered the fragmentation imposed by external circumstances. He began to see his life not as a series of thwarted opportunities, but as an alternative trajectory, one shaped by constraint but not defined by it. This reframing did not erase injustice, but it allowed him to claim agency within it. He had not chosen the conditions of his exclusion, but he had chosen how to respond. That choice, repeated over decades, constituted a form of quiet resistance. Looking outward, he recognized that his story intersected with broader historical movements. The early 20th century had been a period of intense stratification, followed by gradual challenges to entrenched hierarchies. Progress in civil rights and access to education would come, though unevenly and incompletely. He wondered how his life might have unfolded under different circumstances, in a world more willing to recognize brilliance wherever it appeared. This speculation was bittersweet, offering both solace and sorrow. Yet he resisted dwelling too long on hypothetical futures. The reality he inhabited demanded presence. He focused on what remained possible: to think clearly, to mentor thoughtfully, to preserve his work with care. These acts, though modest in scale, held significance beyond immediate reward. They represented continuity in a world that had denied him visibility. By this stage of his life, the contours of his legacy, however informal, had begun to take shape. It would not be measured in citations or named theorems, but in influence quietly exerted, in ideas that found their way into the world without bearing his name. This form of legacy was diffuse and uncertain, but it was real. It challenged conventional metrics of success, inviting a broader understanding of contribution. What emerges from this phase is a portrait of endurance rather than triumph. Endurance of curiosity in the face of neglect. Endurance of integrity amid compromise. Endurance of commitment when recognition proved unreliable. His story complicates the notion that progress naturally rewards merit. It reveals instead a landscape shaped by power, narrative, and selective memory. And as this understanding solidified, it prepared the ground for the final reckoning, not one of public recognition, but of historical reflection. Because the true measure of his life would not be found in accolades received, but in questions raised about who is remembered, who is forgotten, and what is lost when brilliance is allowed to exist only on the margins. With that reckoning in place, His attention shifted from the question of recognition to the quieter, more unsettling question of consequence. Not what his life meant to him, but what it meant to the world that had chosen not to see it. This shift marked another transformation in his thinking, subtle yet profound. For years, he had framed his experience as an individual journey shaped by exclusion. Now he began to see it as evidence of a systemic pattern whose effects extended far beyond a single person. His erasure was not an isolated oversight. It was part of a process that shaped the very contours of knowledge itself. He started to examine how disciplines evolve over time, not only through discovery but through omission. Every field tells a story about itself, a story that selects certain paths as inevitable while rendering others invisible. These stories give the impression of linear progress, as if ideas naturally flow from one recognized figure to the next. But he knew from lived experience that this linearity was constructed. Beneath it lay branching paths, never documented, insights abandoned, not because they failed, but because they lacked institutional shelter. The official narrative of progress was, in this sense, a compression or reduction of complexity into something easier to teach, easier to celebrate, and easier to control. This realization reframed his relationship to history. History, he understood, was not merely a record of what happened. It was a record of what was allowed to matter. In mathematics, this meant that solutions could survive while solvers disappeared, methods could be canonized while origins were blurred. The discipline preserved results while discarding context. This selective preservation had consequences. It shaped how future generations understood not only mathematics, but the nature of creativity and intelligence itself. He began to see how this process reinforced myths about genius. Genius, in the official story, appeared suddenly fully formed, in individuals already positioned to be seen. It rarely emerged from struggle, isolation, or marginality, at least not in ways the narrative acknowledged. By erasing figures like himself, the story of mathematics became cleaner, more palatable, but also less honest. It concealed the conditions under which many ideas actually developed, conditions marked by constraint, improvisation, and resilience. This concealment troubled him deeply. It suggested that the discipline he loved was complicit, however unintentionally, in perpetuating a false image of itself. Mathematics claimed universality, yet its history reflected exclusion. It claimed objectivity, yet its institutions were shaped by social hierarchies. These contradictions did not invalidate the mathematics itself, but they undermined the narratives used to justify authority within the field. He felt an increasing responsibility to hold these contradictions in view, even if he could not resolve them publicly. His own work, viewed through this lens, took on new significance. It was no longer just a private pursuit or a quiet contribution. It was a counterexample, a demonstration that brilliance could flourish outside sanctioned pathways, that insight did not require permission to exist. The fact that this counterexample remained largely unseen did not diminish its importance. If anything, it underscored the urgency of questioning how many such examples had been lost entirely. He revisited his notebooks again, this time with an eye toward coherence across decades. Patterns emerged that he had not fully appreciated before. Themes repeated, deepened, and transformed over time, reflecting a sustained engagement with fundamental questions rather than a series of isolated problems. This continuity reassured him. It confirmed that his work was not a collection of abandoned attempts, but a unified body of thought shaped by long-term commitment. The absence of external recognition had not fractured his intellectual identity. It had, in some ways, strengthened it. At the same time, he became acutely aware of the fragility of this body of work. Without institutional preservation, its survival depended on chance. A misplaced box, a damaged notebook, an uninterested air, any of these could erase decades of thought. This vulnerability weighed on him. It highlighted the difference between personal integrity and collective memory. One could maintain the former without the latter, but doing so risked consigning valuable insight to oblivion. He considered various ways to safeguard his work. Formal donation to an archive seemed unlikely without credentials to justify interest. Self-publication risked obscurity or misinterpretation. Sharing selectively with trusted individuals offered some continuity, but no guarantee of preservation. Each option carried limitations. In the end, he chose a combination of modest strategies, copying key sections, organizing materials carefully, and entrusting portions to those who had shown genuine engagement. These efforts were quiet and imperfect, but they reflected a determination to resist total erasure. As he took these steps, his understanding of legacy evolved. Legacy, he realized, was not always a matter of recognition. Sometimes it was a matter of survival of ideas enduring long enough to be rediscovered, recontextualized, and finally acknowledged. This form of legacy was unpredictable and often delayed. It required patience not just within a lifetime, but across generations. Accepting this uncertainty demanded humility and hope in equal measure. His reflections also extended to the broader social implications of his experience. He saw parallels between the marginalization of knowledge and the marginalization of people. In both cases, systems extracted value while denying agency. Labor could be exploited without acknowledgement. Ideas could be used without credit. The pattern was consistent across domains, suggesting that his story was part of a larger structure of inequality rather than an anomaly confined to academia. This recognition did not lead him to despair. Instead, it sharpened his sense of purpose. If his life illustrated anything, it was the need for vigilance in how societies define merit and preserve memory. He understood that change would not come from individual brilliance alone, but from collective willingness to question narratives that felt comfortable. His role, limited though it was, could be to embody that questioning through example. He became more deliberate in conversations about history and knowledge, gently challenging assumptions without confrontation. When others spoke of progress as inevitable and inclusive, he asked about those left out. When success was attributed solely to talent, he asked about access. These questions did not always receive answers, but they introduced friction into narratives that relied on smoothness. Friction, he believed, was necessary for truth. Over time, he noticed subtle shifts in how people responded. Some dismissed his questions as pessimistic. Others listened, intrigued but uncertain. A few recognized their own experiences reflected in his words. These moments of recognition mattered. They suggested that while institutions might resist change, individuals could still reconsider their assumptions. The seeds of more honest narratives could be planted quietly, even if they took years to grow. His own sense of identity stabilized around this role, not as a celebrated mathematician, but as a witness to the complexities of knowledge production. He did not claim moral superiority. He acknowledged his own limitations and blind spots, but he refused to accept simplified stories that erased struggle and contingency. His life, with all its constraints, stood as evidence that such stories were incomplete. As his later years approached, the urgency he once felt to prove himself diminished further. What replaced it was a quieter determination to remain faithful to understanding as he had always practiced it, patiently, rigorously, without expectation of reward. This fidelity sustained him. It allowed him to look back on his life without bitterness, even as he recognized its injustices. He had not been given the platform his work deserved, but he had not surrendered his commitment to truth. The world beyond him continued to evolve, revisiting questions of access, representation, and historical omission with growing intensity. He observed these developments with cautious interest. On one hand, they affirmed what he had long understood. On the other, they highlighted how slowly systems change. Recognition of past erasures did not automatically restore what had been lost. It did, however, open the possibility of more honest futures. He imagined a future historian encountering traces of his work, puzzled by its absence from canonical narratives. Perhaps that historian would ask why certain names appeared and others did not. Perhaps they would follow those questions into deeper examinations of power and memory. This possibility, however remote, offered a measure of consolation. It suggested that erasure was not always final. Sometimes it was merely deferred. By the end of this chapter of his life, the meaning of his journey had crystallized. It was not a story of failure or success in conventional terms. It was a story of persistence under constraint, of insight surviving without acknowledgement, of integrity maintained in the absence of reward. His experience challenged simplistic notions of progress and genius, revealing instead a landscape shaped by human choice and institutional power. What his life demonstrated most clearly was that knowledge does not belong exclusively to those who are celebrated. It belongs also to those who labor quietly, whose contributions circulate without names, whose insights shape the world invisibly. Recognizing this truth does not diminish the achievements of those remembered. It enriches our understanding of how those achievements came to be. And so, as this part of his story draws to a close, it leaves us not with resolution, but with responsibility, the responsibility to question the narratives we inherit, to look more carefully at whose work we value, and to recognize that behind every polished account of progress lie countless unseen efforts. His life asks us to consider what is lost when we accept history as it is given, and what might be gained if we learn to read between its lines. As responsibility settled more firmly into his understanding of the past, he became increasingly aware that the most enduring damage of erasure was not personal loss, but distortion. When contributions vanish from the record, the shape of history itself changes. Causes appear simpler than they were. Progress seems smoother, more inevitable. Struggle fades into abstraction. The boy, now long past the age when anyone would still call him that, recognized that his absence from the narrative did more than deny him credit. It altered how future generations would understand the nature of discovery. Without stories like his, brilliance appeared to arise only where conditions were already favorable, reinforcing the illusion that talent naturally congregates around privilege. This distortion mattered deeply to him because it influenced expectations. Young minds learning mathematics were taught, implicitly and explicitly, what a mathematician looked like, where they came from, how they advanced. These lessons shaped aspiration long before ability could assert itself. He had lived the consequences of that shaping. He knew how easily potential could be redirected or extinguished when it failed to align with expectation. His own survival as a thinker had depended on stubbornness, on a refusal to internalize limits imposed from outside. But he also knew that not everyone had the resources, emotional, intellectual, or circumstantial, to sustain such refusal indefinitely. He reflected often on how close he himself had come to disappearance. Not physical disappearance, but the quieter kind, the gradual narrowing of curiosity until it no longer reached outward, the slow erosion of confidence that transforms engagement into withdrawal. He had resisted that erosion, but not without cost. Loneliness had been its constant companion. Isolation had sharpened his mind but thinned his sense of belonging. He wondered how many others, encountering similar barriers without his particular temperament or timing, had simply stopped asking questions. Those lost questions haunted him more than his own lost recognition. This awareness deepened his commitment to preserving not just his work, but the context of its creation. Context, he believed, was essential for honest understanding. Without it, ideas floated free of responsibility, appearing as spontaneous miracles rather than products of lived experience. He began to annotate his notebooks more extensively, adding reflections on why certain problems had mattered to him, what conditions had shaped his approach, where access had been denied and where improvisation had filled the gap. These annotations were not confessions or complaints. They were attempts at completeness, efforts to ensure that if the work ever resurfaced, it would carry traces of the word that produced it. He also revisited correspondence he had saved over the years, letters exchanged with teachers, scholars, and peers. Reading them with distance, he noticed patterns he had not fully appreciated at the time. Politeness that masked discomfort. Praise carefully worded to avoid commitment. Encouragement paired with caution. These documents, taken together, revealed a choreography of deflection more clearly than any single interaction had. They showed how institutions could maintain an appearance of openness while quietly enforcing boundaries. He preserved these letters alongside his mathematical work, recognizing their value as evidence of process rather than grievance. As his health began to impose limits on his daily routines, he adjusted again, focusing his energy on synthesis rather than exploration. Instead of pushing into entirely new areas, he sought to integrate decades of thinking into cohesive frameworks. This work was demanding in a different way. It required patience, restraint, and the willingness to let go of avenues that no longer served the whole. He treated it as an act of distillation, extracting essential insights from a lifetime of inquiry. This synthesis revealed a recurring theme, the interplay between constraint and creativity. Many of his most original insights had emerged not despite limitation, but because of it. Restricted access had forced him to rebuild knowledge from first principles. Marginality had freed him from certain orthodoxies, allowing him to approach problems without inherited assumptions. This did not justify the constraints imposed on him, but it complicated their effects. Constraint had shaped his thinking in ways both damaging and generative. Recognizing this complexity allowed him to resist simplistic narratives about oppression, producing either pure harm or pure resilience. Reality, he knew, was less accommodating. He became increasingly interested in how such complexities could be communicated without distortion. Public discourse often demanded clarity at the expense of nuance. Stories were expected to resolve cleanly, with heroes and villains clearly defined. His experience resisted such resolution. There were individuals who had supported him genuinely, even if they lacked power to change outcomes. There were institutions that had benefited from his work without conscious malice, operating within inherited structures rather than deliberate cruelty. Acknowledging these shades of gray did not absolve injustice, but it did make it intelligible. This insistence on nuance shaped how he spoke when asked about his life. He avoided framing himself as a victim, not because he denied harm, but because that framing risked obscuring agency and complexity. He spoke instead about systems, about patterns, about the difference between intent and effect. He emphasized that injustice often persisted not through overt hostility but through inertia. Systems continued doing what they had always done, rewarding familiarity and penalizing deviation. Change required more than goodwill. It required structural attention. As conversations about representation and access gained momentum in broader society, he observed them with cautious optimism. On one hand, they echoed arguments he had internalized long ago. On the other, he recognized how easily such conversations could become symbolic, addressing visibility without addressing power. Inclusion, he believed, was not simply a matter of adding new faces to old structures. It required re-examining the structures themselves, the criteria for recognition, the pathways to participation, the narratives that defined legitimacy. He was realistic about the pace of such change. History had taught him that institutions rarely transformed quickly or completely. Gains were often partial, uneven, and vulnerable to reversal. Yet he also understood that progress, however limited, could create openings that did not exist before. He took some comfort in the idea that his experience, though painful, might contribute indirectly to broader awareness. Even if his name remained absent, the questions his life raised could still matter. In moments of reflection, he considered how his story might be told if it were told at all. Would it be framed as tragedy, emphasizing loss and injustice? Would it be framed as inspiration, highlighting perseverance against odds? Both framings felt inadequate. Tragedy risked reducing his life to suffering. Inspiration risked romanticizing hardship. He preferred a third framing, one that acknowledged constraint without glorifying it, that recognized resilience without demanding it as a moral obligation. He had not been allowed to shape the narrative of his time, but he might still shape questions that future narratives would have to answer. In this sense, his influence, though indirect, was real. The deeper lesson of this phase of his life lay in the distinction between visibility and value. Visibility could be granted or withheld by institutions. Value, he believed, was inherent in understanding itself. This belief did not deny the importance of recognition. It contextualized it. Recognition mattered because it shaped opportunity and memory, but it did not define truth. Truth existed independently, even if it struggled to find voice. By holding fast to this distinction, he preserved a sense of dignity that erasure could not fully strip away. His life remained marked by injustice, but it was not defined by it. He had engaged deeply with the world of ideas, contributed to its growth, and prepared his work with care. Whatever history chose to do with that work lay beyond his control. What remained within his control, until the very end, was the integrity of his engagement with mathematics, with memory, with the questions his life raised. This integrity, quiet and uncelebrated, stood as his final answer to a system that had refused to acknowledge him. And in that answer lay a challenge, not spoken loudly but insistent nonetheless, to look more carefully at how we tell our stories of progress, and to ask whose lives, whose insights, and whose labor have been left in the margins of those stories without explanation. As the final stretch of his life unfolded, the sense of challenge he carried inwardly became quieter but more focused. It was no longer directed at institutions or histories that had already solidified without him, but at the future that would inherit those histories unquestioned. What concerned him most was not that he had been forgotten, but that forgetting had become normalized. Forgetting had become a habit, a background condition so familiar that few noticed its consequences. He understood now that erasure does not always announce itself as injustice. More often, it presents itself as completion. As a story told so confidently that no one thinks to ask what has been left out. This understanding sharpened his attention to the way narratives are taught and repeated. He noticed how simplification, while useful for instruction, often hardened into dogma. Complex developments were reduced to linear progressions, each step neatly attributed, each outcome appearing inevitable. The messiness of real discovery false starts, marginal contributions, parallel insights emerging in isolation were stripped away. In its place stood a polished account that reassured learners that the system worked as intended. This reassurance, he knew, came at a cost. It taught obedience to narrative rather than curiosity about truth. He reflected on his own early years, on how he had absorbed these same narratives before his experience contradicted them. He had believed that mathematics rewarded clarity and effort above all else. That belief had not been foolish, it had been incomplete. What his life revealed was that clarity and effort operate within social frameworks that determine who is seen as credible. Without understanding those frameworks, learners are left unprepared for the realities they may encounter. They internalize failure where none exists, mistaking exclusion for inadequacy. This realization deepened his sense of moral urgency, even as his physical energy declined. He began to see his role less as a contributor of specific ideas and more as a bearer of insight about how knowledge moves or fails to move through the world. This insight was not easily quantifiable. It did not lend itself to equations or proofs, but it was no less rigorous for that. It emerged from sustained observation, from decades of engagement with systems that claimed neutrality while practicing selectivity. He thought often about the future students who would enter mathematics with enthusiasm and trust, believing that the discipline's ideals of objectivity and universality applied equally to all. He did not want to strip them of that enthusiasm. He believed deeply in the beauty and power of mathematics. What he wanted was for that trust to be informed rather than naive, for learners to understand that ideals are aspirations, not guarantees, and that vigilance is required to bring practice closer to principle. This desire influenced how he framed his reflections in the materials he left behind. He avoided bitterness, he avoided accusation. Instead, he focused on patterns, on structures, on questions that invited examination rather than defensiveness. He wanted future readers to arrive at conclusions themselves, guided by evidence rather than persuasion. This approach mirrored his mathematical practice: present the structure clearly, allow the implications to unfold. He also considered how easily stories like his could be co-opted if they were ever told. Narratives of overlooked genius often become morality tales, used to inspire without challenging underlying conditions. They celebrate individual perseverance while leaving systems intact. He resisted this framing instinctively. His life, he believed, should not be used to suggest that endurance under injustice is admirable or sufficient. Endurance was sometimes necessary, but it was never ideal. The goal was not to romanticize struggle, but to eliminate unnecessary struggle altogether. This distinction mattered deeply to him. He did not want his experience to become a cautionary tale that discouraged participation, nor an inspirational myth that excused exclusion. He wanted it to function as evidence that systems require scrutiny, that merit is mediated by power, that progress without accountability can perpetuate harm even as it advances. Such evidence, he hoped, would provoke reflection rather than resignation. In his later reflections, he became increasingly aware of how silence operates across generations. Silence, he realized, is not merely the absence of speech, it is an inheritance. Each generation inherits not only what was said, but what was left unsaid, what was normalized through omission. Breaking that silence requires effort and risk. It requires willingness to complicate familiar stories. He understood why many avoided this work. Complexity is uncomfortable. It destabilizes certainty. But without it, injustice persists quietly, unchallenged. He saw parallels between this inherited silence and the mathematical concept of hidden variables, factors that influence outcomes without being explicitly represented. Just as ignoring hidden variables can lead to flawed models, ignoring silenced histories can lead to distorted understandings of progress. In both cases, the solution is not to discard the model, but to refine it, to account for what was previously excluded. This analogy, bridging his intellectual and lived experience, felt fitting. As his time grew shorter, his thoughts turned less toward what he had accomplished and more toward what he had learned. He had learned that systems often protect themselves by appearing complete, that questioning completeness is an act of care, not hostility, that integrity sometimes means continuing to work even when the work is unseen. These lessons did not erase the injustice he endured, but they gave it meaning beyond personal grievance. He also learned humility, not the humility imposed by exclusion, but the humility that comes from recognizing one as placed within a vast, interconnected web of effort. His ideas were not unique in isolation. Others had arrived at similar insights through different paths. This did not diminish his contribution. It contextualized it. Knowledge, he understood, is cumulative and communal, even when recognition is not. His frustration was never with others' success, but with the narrowness of systems that could not accommodate multiplicity. This humility allowed him to release some of the lingering tension he had carried for years. He no longer felt compelled to measure himself against narratives that excluded him. He measured himself instead against his own standards of rigor and honesty. By those measures he felt at peace. He had not abandoned his curiosity. He had not compromised his commitment to understanding. He had not allowed bitterness to replace engagement. In quiet moments he returned again to the idea of questions. Questions he believed were more durable than answers. Answers can be superseded, revised, or forgotten. Questions persist, resurfacing whenever conditions allow. If his life had contributed anything lasting, it was a set of questions about access, recognition, and memory. These questions did not belong to him alone. They belonged to anyone who cared about the integrity of knowledge. He imagined a future classroom where students were encouraged not only to learn established results, but to ask how those results entered the canon. Who had been involved? Who had been excluded? What conditions had shaped discovery? Such a classroom, he believed, would not weaken mathematics. It would strengthen it, grounding abstraction in human reality. It would produce thinkers capable of both technical excellence and ethical awareness. This vision sustained him as physical limitations increased. Even as his capacity for sustained work diminished, his clarity remained. He took comfort in knowing that ideas, once formed, do not vanish simply because their originators do. They circulate, transform, reappear. Sometimes they do so stripped of context. Sometimes they carry traces of their beginnings. He hoped his work would fall into the latter category, carrying with it enough evidence to prompt inquiry. The inevitability of his own absence no longer frightened him. What concerned him was whether absence itself would continue to be mistaken for insignificance. He had lived long enough to know that absence from record does not equal absence of impact. Many of the most influential forces operate invisibly, shaping outcomes without acknowledgement. Recognizing this does not justify erasure, but it does challenge simplistic equations between visibility and value. As he prepared to step out of the present and into whatever came next, he felt a quiet resolve. He had done what he could within the limits imposed on him. He had thought deeply, preserved carefully, spoken honestly when possible, and resisted the temptation to distort his experience into something more palatable. His life remained incomplete in the eyes of official history, but it was coherent in his own understanding. The final challenge he left behind was not a theorem or a proof, but a lens. A way of looking at progress that demands attentiveness to what is missing. A reminder that every polished narrative casts shadows, and that those shadows deserve examination. He did not expect this challenge to be taken up easily or quickly. Change, he knew, rarely moves at the pace of insight, but he trusted that questions have a way of finding receptive minds, even across time. Somewhere someone would encounter a gap that felt wrong, a story that felt too smooth, an account that left something unexplained. In that moment of unease, his life, as lesson, would find its opening, and in that opening lay the possibility not of belated recognition for him, but of a more honest future for those who would come after, one in which brilliance would be met not with suspicion or silence, but with the careful attention it had always deserved. As the weight of years finally pressed fully into the present, what remained was not regret but reckoning. Not a reckoning with institutions that had already moved on, nor with history already written, but with the quiet truth that lives beyond official memory. He understood, in a way that no archive could capture, that the most enduring legacies are not always the ones etched into books or carved into reputation. Sometimes they exist as disruptions, subtle, persistent disturbances in the stories we tell ourselves about fairness, progress, and merit. He had spent a lifetime observing how certainty is constructed, how systems reinforce their own legitimacy by narrowing the range of acceptable narratives, how complexity is trimmed away, not out of malice alone, but out of convenience. Simpler stories travel faster. They comfort more easily. They demand less responsibility from those who inherit them. And yet it is precisely those simplified stories that allow injustice to persist unnoticed, generation after generation. In his final reflections, he returned again and again to the idea of inheritance. Not inheritance of wealth or status, but inheritance of understanding. Every generation inherits not just facts, but frameworks, ways of interpreting the world that feel natural only because they are familiar. He had inherited a framework that promised objectivity and reward through merit. His life had revealed the limits of that promise. What concerned him now was how that same framework would be passed on, unexamined, to others. He recognized that progress, as it is commonly described, often functions like a moving walkway. It carries those already aligned with it forward, while leaving others struggling to step on. From a distance, it appears as collective motion. Up close, the disparities are unmistakable. His own experience had unfolded along the edge of that walkway, close enough to see its mechanisms, too far to benefit from its momentum. This vantage point, though painful, had granted him a clarity unavailable to those carried along effortlessly. That clarity shaped how he understood his own disappearance from the record. Disappearance, he realized, is rarely total. It is partial, uneven, selective. Pieces remain scattered, ideas without names, methods without origin, insights divorced from context. These fragments circulate quietly, doing work without acknowledgement. In this sense, erasure is never complete. It leaves residues that attentive minds can detect. He imagined such minds in the future. Scholars who would pause over anomalies rather than smoothing them away. Students who would notice gaps in attribution and ask why they existed. Historians who would resist the temptation to treat absence as insignificance. These imagined figures did not need to know his name to engage with his legacy. They needed only the willingness to question completeness, to suspect that something essential had been left out. This hope did not depend on optimism about institutions. It depended on individuals. Individuals willing to slow down, to look beneath the surface, to accept discomfort as part of understanding. He believed such individuals existed in every generation, often at the margins, often unheard at first. His own life had been shaped by their absence in positions of power, but he trusted their persistence nonetheless. In the final phase of his life, his relationship with mathematics itself softened into something almost meditative. Problems no longer demanded conquest, they invited contemplation. He revisited familiar structures not to extend them but to appreciate their elegance. He found satisfaction in coherence, in the way ideas interlocked across time. This appreciation did not negate his earlier struggles. It contextualized them, allowing him to see his work as part of a continuum larger than recognition. He also found himself thinking more about the emotional dimensions of erasure, not the anger, which had long since cooled, but the quiet grief of being unseen. Grief, he realized, is not only about loss of opportunity, it is about loss of witness. To be witnessed, to have one, as efforts acknowledged as real, is a fundamental human need. Its denial leaves marks that cannot be quantified. Acknowledging this did not weaken him. It humanized his understanding of injustice, grounding it in lived experience rather than abstraction. This humanization mattered because it resisted a dangerous tendency, the tendency to treat stories like his as intellectual exercises rather than moral realities. He did not want future readers to engage with his life merely as a case study in systemic bias. He wanted them to feel, however faintly, the cost of that bias, the loneliness, the uncertainty, the constant recalibration of hope. Without that feeling, critique risks becoming detached, losing its urgency. At the same time, he resisted allowing pain to dominate the narrative. His life was not defined solely by what was denied to him. It was also defined by what he had built internally, a resilient mind, a disciplined curiosity, an unwavering commitment to understanding. These achievements were invisible to most, but they were real. They sustained him. They allowed him to live with integrity even when recognition proved unreliable. In contemplating his own end, he felt no need for vindication. Vindication implies reversal, a correction of record that restores balance. He knew such correction might never come, at least not in his name. What he hoped for instead was awareness, a shift, however small, in how stories of progress are told and received. Awareness that brilliance does not require permission to exist. Awareness that systems often lag behind the ideals they proclaim. Awareness that history, left unexamined, repeats its omissions. He also understood that awareness alone is not enough. Awareness must be paired with responsibility. Responsibility to seek out suppressed voices. Responsibility to question authority without assuming its infallibility. responsibility to recognize that neutrality is often claimed, rarely achieved. These responsibilities, he believed, belonged not only to institutions, but to individuals, teachers, students, researchers, readers, anyone who engages with knowledge seriously. In this sense, his story did not end with him. It extended outward, implicating all who encounter it. It asks something of them. Not admiration, not pity, but attention. Attention to the spaces where narratives thin out. Attention to the ease with which absence is normalized. Attention to the difference between what is celebrated and what is essential. As his thoughts circled these ideas, he felt a quiet gratitude, not for the injustice he endured, but for the understanding it had forced upon him. Understanding, he had learned, is not always gentle. It often arrives through contradiction, through dissonance between belief and reality. But once gained, it cannot be relinquished. It reshapes how one sees the world, how one listens, how one remembers. He trusted that this understanding would outlive him, carried forward not by institutions, but by curiosity itself. Curiosity has a way of slipping through cracks, of surviving neglect, of resurfacing where least expected. It had sustained him when external support vanished. It would, he believed, continue to sustain others navigating similar margins. And so, as his story reaches its close, it does so without spectacle. There is no final revelation, no sudden restoration of credit, no dramatic reversal of fortune. There is only continuity, the quiet persistence of ideas, questions, and challenges that refuse to be contained by silence. If this story stayed with you, if it unsettled you, or made you reconsider how history decides who matters, now is the moment to subscribe to the Black Timeline. Tap the bell icon, so you never miss the stories that history tried to smooth over. And leave a comment sharing how deeply this story affected you. Because forgotten history does not vanish, it lingers, and sometimes it waits patiently, not to be celebrated, but to be understood.